Now that year one of Kevin Durant in Phoenix is over, it's time to look back at the initial Kevin Durant trade that sent him to Phoenix from Brooklyn. Because I think depending on what happens this offseason, which we're going to talk about, as well as going into next year and the year after that, this trade could either be fantastic for Phoenix or a complete disaster. Really quickly though, I want to thank the sponsor of today's video, Prize Picks. Prize Picks is a great way to add a little bit of fun to your viewing experience this postseason. And right now on Prize Picks, you can get a 100% deposit match up to $100 when you use code SPORTING or you click the link in the description. But that is not the only promotion right now for the postseason. Because right now on Prize Picks, you have an opportunity to become a millionaire. Every day that we have left of the postseason, Prize Picks is going to pick one entry, and if that entry gets a certain number of selections correct, you can see those payouts on screen all the way up to $1 million. And all you have to do is play Prize Picks like normally, like you have been, and make sure you opt into this millionaire promotion when you play. If you've never played Prize Picks before, all you do is it's you against the numbers. You go online, you pick between 2 and 6 selections. You pick more or less for each of these numbers, whether it be three-pointers made, turnovers, rebounds, blocks, all these different things, which are really interesting now in the postseason with these really high-profile games, because obviously the stars are heavily involved and they play a ton of minutes. And if you get enough selections correct, you win some cash. And again, you have that opportunity with the millionaire promotion every day of the postseason this year as well. And as I mentioned in the beginning, if you want to get started today, you can get a 100% deposit match up to $100 for first-time depositors on Prize Picks when you use code SPORTING or click the link down in the description below. And thank you again to Prize Picks for sponsoring this video. Okay, so let's go back to the trade itself. The deal was Kevin Durant and TJ Warren in exchange for Cam Johnson, Mikal Bridges, Jay Crowder, 4 first-round picks, and a pick swap. And the idea at the time for Phoenix was that yes, you're giving up your depth, you're giving up 2 interesting wings, but you're getting back one of the best scorers in the entire league that even though he did have some injury issues during the season and was 34 years old at the time, you have the big 4 of Chris Paul, DeAndre Ayton, and then more importantly, Devin Booker and Kevin Durant. And that should be able to overcome any depth issues that you might have. There were some relatively interesting players still on the roster in Phoenix, and a championship core looked like it was developing there for the Suns, and it was the reason that Durant wanted to go there in the first place. Both times that he requested a trade, Phoenix was on his list because he wanted to play with Devin Booker, but also because they had those 2 other complementary players in Paul and Ayton you could very easily see Phoenix making a championship push with. Now, it was going to be difficult trading for someone like Durant, giving up as much as Phoenix did in the middle of the season, which was made even more difficult by some injury issues that he had once he arrived in Phoenix. Even after overcoming an injury, he was still recovering for Brooklyn. But even with all of those things together, there was real championship optimism at the time of the deal. But what's developed now in the postseason for Phoenix is that big 4 actually just a big 2, not just on the floor as we saw in the postseason, but potentially moving forward into next year. DeAndre Ayton did not perform well at all in the postseason, especially for someone that's a former number 1 overall pick that everybody agrees is talented, but for whatever reason just cannot quite put it all together. And then Chris Paul predictably got hurt. And funnily enough, that Phoenix team in the postseason looked a lot like the KD Kyrie teams in Brooklyn last year, where it was just those 2 guys and a bunch of role players that weren't very good trying to carry those teams to wins. And all of a sudden it looked like, why did Kevin Durant want to go to this team in the first place? And the question becomes now, in the aftermath of this trade and then being eliminated in the postseason, are Chris Paul and DeAndre Ayton, both or one of them, going to still be on the team next season? I think they're certainly going to look to move one or both of those guys. Whether or not they're successful really just depends on their value and how much Phoenix really wants to put into trying to make this a ready-made championship contender for next season. But I don't think it's out of the question that the only 2 players remaining from that big 4 going into next year are just Durant and Booker. Getting back to the trade for a second, to be fair to Phoenix, a midseason trade like this is really, really difficult to win a championship with in the very first season that you make the deal. We've never seen a trade like this where a team gives up this much for one player, this high level of a player in the middle of the year. And keep in mind, before they made the Durant trade, because of some injury issues and some other things, Phoenix was not that good. They were a couple of games over 500. It's not like they were the 2 seed that traded in their wings to get an even better player in Durant. They were kind of a middle of the pack team, and those championship expectations only came about because of how incredible Durant and Booker could potentially be together, and they were that good in the postseason, just wasn't quite enough to overcome a really, really good Denver team. And really, I think one of the narratives that I'm seeing about this trade now is it wasn't necessarily just to try and win a title this season, because really when you make a deal like this and you give up this many guys, you need an off-season cycle to bring in some veterans that want to chase some rings, to bring in a guy in a mid-level exception, or move a couple of second-round picks, or get an interesting rookie, whatever the case may be, to build out the roster roster a little bit. So you're not relying on Landry Shamet, Bismack Biyamo, Jacques Landale, Terrence Ross, some guys that they got, in the middle of the season like Terrence Ross that they hoped would help them in the postseason as role players that never really developed that way. But when you're giving up this many pieces, a lot of people's mindset was you need an offseason cycle to add some other pieces, which is true. But also, I can assure you that when Matt Ishbia decided to go all in, trade Mikal Bridges, trade all these things, the idea was we have a great shot to win a title this year. This was not just like, house money. This was not just, oh man, it would be really cool if we won the title this year, but that's not really the point. The point absolutely was to try and compete. You don't trade all that stuff for a 34-year-old and Kevin Durant unless you're trying to compete. And the fact that they didn't really look all that competitive in the postseason is a real issue for this trade moving forward. And going into next year, depending on what they do with Ayton and Paul and trying to add more pieces to the roster, they certainly could be a championship contending team. But in a rising Western Conference, it's not a guarantee by any means that they're one of the 2 or 3 favorites to even make the finals out of their own conference. Now, personally, I still would be afraid of them if I was in the West, if they're healthy. Like if Paul is still there and Ayton maybe figures it out a little bit, they build a little bit more chemistry, they add some pieces along the edges, especially in terms of floor spacing and defense, I still would not be excited about playing Kevin Durant and Devin Booker. We saw in the postseason how incredible those guys can be just from a shot making perspective, and that still would be something that I would be afraid of. However, the other side of this coin for Phoenix is if you're just eliminating DeAndre Ayton from the conversation, whether that be because he's just never as good as you want him to be or they trade him away for whatever this offseason, the only young piece that's really pushing your team forward, that raises the ceiling of your team as well as the floor moving forward in terms of those picks that you owe to Brooklyn we're going to talk about here in a second, is Devin Booker. Devin Booker is the only guy that really elevates your team moving forward that you're excited about for the future beyond, maybe 2 years from now, assuming DeAndre Ayton doesn't become the number 1 overall pick that Phoenix hoped that he would be when they drafted him. And that's a real concern when you have picks owed to a team like Brooklyn as many years out into the future as Phoenix does. It can get pretty scary here pretty quickly beyond just, oh man, I hope we win a title at some point. And so just wrapping up the Phoenix side here, it wouldn't shock me at all if we have Paul or Ayton move this offseason. And if they don't win a title, I do think that the trade is a failure. I mean, trading away that much of your future, even on a team that at the time was just a couple of games above 500, but did have some options in terms of moving Paul and waiting on these wings to develop a little bit more, especially after we saw what Mikal Bridges became in Brooklyn. If they don't win a championship at some point, it's a failure. If they do, I think it's a success. Any trade that leads directly to you winning a title is absolutely a success. I just don't know if it'll happen with Paul or Ayton still on the roster. Now we got to talk about the Brooklyn side of this. I'm a little bit, I don't want to use the term bias, but I'm very, very invested in this as a Nets fan. And Mikal Bridges was awesome. I mean, he was unbelievable, certainly way higher than what my expectations were for him. Cam Johnson was very good as well. He's a restricted free agent. I would really, really expect Brooklyn to match almost any offer for Cam Johnson in the offseason because he was such a big piece of the Durant trade. And then you've got, a couple second round picks you've got for Crowder and of course all of these future picks from Phoenix. And I would expect Brooklyn to just continue to roll over the assets of this as well as the Kyrie trade rather than, dump Mikal Bridges for a handful of first round picks, which was offered to them at the deadline. I think they've got a decent shot here of building something pretty competitive over the next couple of seasons. And in the long term, I think this trade will eventually look really, really good for them, especially when you consider that Durant probably wasn't going to stick around much longer anyway, even if they didn't move him at the deadline. The Bridges thing is really interesting because people were very excited about what he did post-trade, as they should be. The only thing I would push back on is Mikal Bridges, as of right now, in my opinion, is not the number 1 guy in a championship team. I think Chris Middleton is a really good comp for him in terms of what he can contribute to a championship level team. Can be a shot creator, can shoot the ball, can defend. But if you're looking for the guy you're just going to give the ball to and say, take us home, he's probably not that guy in the long term. And I do think there was a little bit of hot shooting that helped him be as good as he was post-trade. But even having said that, this looks to be a really, really good haul for Brooklyn and something that helps them in their future. They have more flexibility now because of these Phoenix picks if they did want to add a star to the group. And then of course you always still have the mystery question mark that is Ben Simmons in terms of what he could potentially be for this team down the road as well. And then my last point just overall on the trade is things could get pretty weird pretty quickly for Kevin Durant because we're all just assuming he's going to continue to be good over the next couple of seasons. I certainly hope that he will be, but there have been some injury issues piling up. This is yet another team that he has decided this is now the team where I'm going to win my title outside of Golden State. And if it doesn't happen and he forced his way to this team, that's going to, I mean, he already has a pretty damaged legacy in a lot of people's eyes, but this could be potentially the nail in the coffin of the, top 15 player of all time case for KD, just because of how strange of a career it's been and how many different times he's tried to give himself an opportunity to redeem himself in a lot of people's eyes for the decision that he made to go to Golden State. And if it doesn't happen in Phoenix, it's going to be pretty damaging to his legacy long term. But as always with these kinds of massive deals, things can change overnight. The Nets could get someone awesome with one of these picks. Bridges could fall off a little bit compared to what he was post-trade, and the Suns could win the title next year, and this could look completely different. But right now, it's a super interesting deal to look back on.